It was late afternoon and the park was full of life with people all over the place taking advantage of the nice weather. A large open field provided plenty of room for a man to play frisbee with his dog and for two families to have picnics, while a cluster of trees provided shade for all who needed it. Playground equipment drew nearly every kid in the park towards it like moths to a flame, while an old man and woman stood by the duck pond competing to see who could get the most ducks to eat their crumbs. 16-year-old Chris sat back on a bench watching all this activity with some amusement as he often did. He loved coming this park on busy days just so he could do some people watching. He never knew exactly who or what he'd see, but there were often interesting surprises. Chris watched a crazy-looking homeless man who'd been wandering around the park for the last half hour. He kept confronting people and demanding money, then getting pissed when they wouldn't give him any. Once Chris had seen him explode into a tirade, yelling all in rhyme at some confused man who wouldn't give him any change. It had been all Chris could do to keep from laughing as the homeless man's victim hurried off as fast as he could. Once the strange homeless man wandered off and left the park, Chris turned his attention to a very sexy and busted-looking woman that drew his eyes to her, just as surely as the playground drew the attention of the kids. She was walking side by side with a skinny and very nerdy-looking guy, which filled Chris with some hope for himself. Chris wasn't all that nerdy-looking, but he was skinny and a little short for his age, which made him less than interesting for most girls at school. But if a guy who looked a stereotypical nerd could get a babe like that, then maybe Chris could too. Maybe all I need is to strike it rich, Chris chuckled. Then Chris suddenly saw three boys from his school walking in his direction, though fortunately they hadn't seen him yet. These were three of the school bullies, ones who loved messing with everyone, but took a special delight in screwing with him. "Aw shit," Chris grimaced. The leader of the group was Ron, a large and athletic boy who was a jock by nature, but got kicked off the football team for being too undisciplined and causing too much trouble. He was the one who had it out for Chris due to a small incident last year. Ron had asked a popular girl to go out with him using a really bad pickup line. She'd verbally skewered Ron as a result, and unfortunately for Chris, he'd overheard the exchange and couldn't resist laughing. Ron had taken that a little personally. Ron's friends were Kyle and Lewis. Kyle was a large and rather mean boy who enjoyed making other people scared of him, though he didn't have enough imagination to come up with much on his own. He seemed the sort to one day become a mindless thug or bouncer. Lewis, on the other hand, was a skinny boy who used to get picked on himself until he joined up with the bullies and found it much more fun to pick on others instead. Chris sighed and got up, looking for a way out of there before Ron and his crew saw him. However, he realized that he was too slow because they'd already seen him and were coming straight at him with nasty grins on their faces. "Just great," Chris sighed. It was such a nice day too. Chris knew he could start running immediately and that he might even be able to get away. However, he also knew that this would just get the other boys excited and would encourage them to play the game even more in the future. Besides, Chris hated running from anyone. Well, Ron smirked as he came over to Chris, "if it isn't little Chris." "Maybe we should call you Christine," Lewis added with a broad grin. "Yeah," Kyle added, "'cause you're the size of a girl." Chris just rolled his eyes and responded, well, if it isn't Larry, Moe and Curly." "You think that's funny?" Ron snarled, shoving Chris backwards and then advancing. "I'm sorry," Chris apologized. "That's a horrible insult to the Stooges." Ron definitely wasn't happy about that, while Lewis just echoed Ron's reactions. Kyle scowled in a threatening manner, but looked just slightly lost. Chris wondered if the big guy even had a clue as to who the three Stooges were. "I think you'd be a lot more afraid of us considering the situation," Ron scowled, nodding to Kyle, who then grabbed Chris' shoulder in a painful grip. "I think you're right," Chris responded with thoughtful look. "It's probably a side effect of—" "Oh, never mind." Ron scowled, then demanded, "A side effect of what?" I've been eating this fruit," Chris explained nervously. "It's called small fruit. I mean, it's the stuff they actually make Viagra out of." And damn does it work. Really? Louis asked excited. Where do you get it? I have an uncle who sent us a whole case, Chris said. All I have to do is eat 2 a day and bam. You can go for hours. I certainly don't need it. Ron glared at Chris and then his friends. After a moment he hesitantly asked, You said small? Okay, eat 2 small. Suddenly Chris interrupted, but I'm sure you hear that from your girlfriend all the time. It's too small? Kyle frowned at what Ron had just said. Ron and Kyle both glared at Chris in anger while Louis was fighting back a snicker of amusement. You think that's funny? Ron snarled, suddenly punching Chris in the stomach and dropping him to his knees. Chris gasped in pain and braced himself to get kicked and worse, knowing that he should have kept his mouth shut, but he just couldn't resist messing with these guys. Hilarious. Just then a man yelled, Hey you kids, stop that. Ron looked around and suddenly remembered they were in the middle of a park and surrounded by a lot of witnesses. He muttered, Fuck. Then he punched Chris again and nodded towards the duck pond. Kyle grinned, grabbed Chris and shoved him all the way to the water and threw him in. Then the 3 bullies stood on the edge laughed at Chris. Now that's hilarious, Ron exclaimed before he and the others started to walk off. We'll have to do this again sometime. Chris forced a grin, knowing that unfortunately it would happen again. Ron would probably be waiting at school tomorrow to continue from where they'd been interrupted. Oh joy, he muttered sarcastically, I can hardly wait. Chris climbed out of the duck point with a forced smile. He was sore, soaking wet and miserable, but determined not to show it. He didn't see Ron and the goons still around, but didn't want to give them the satisfaction anyway. Suddenly Chris heard a girl exclaim, That was pretty ballsy kid, I think I like you. Chris turned and saw a girl standing there with a smirk on her face. She was a very pretty blonde girl of about 14 who looked as though she'd be really hot in a few years. The girl was also wearing a red t-shirt with the anarchy symbol on the front. Who are you calling kid? Chris asked her with a grin. You're younger than I am. Am I? The girl asked with a look of amusement. Suddenly she seemed older, looking like a woman of 30 instead of a teenager. I wouldn't be so sure of that. Then just as suddenly she was younger again, now 16 just like Chris. He also noticed that her shirt had changed and instead of the anarchy symbol it had the words Little Miss written across the front. What? Chris gasped in surprise, taking an instinctive step backwards. How'd you? Magic. She grinned at him, holding out her hand, the name's Chiff. Hi, Chris responded, regaining his composure and smiling as he hesitantly shook her hand. But as Chris was shaking her hand, he suddenly noticed a tiny woman sitting on Chiff's shoulder. The woman had to be about 4 inches tall with green hair, dragonfly wings on her back, and was wearing a Led Zeppelin t-shirt. Oh, that's Pip, Chiff grinned mischievously as she saw Chris' eyes. She's a pixie. Chris stared at the tiny woman who just flipped him off and shook his head. Okay. Nice to meet you. What? Pip demanded, looking offended. Where the fuck is the I don't believe in fairies line? I was kind of looking forward to playing dead and getting you to do that stupid-ass clapping thing. Chris chuckled in amusement at the reference to Peter Pan, then explained either I hit my head when I went into the pond and am seeing things, so I might as well go along with it, or you're real so there's no reason for me to freak out. Most people don't believe in pixies, Pip grumbled, still looking annoyed that her game had been ruined. Or dragons. Well, Chris said cautiously, I just figured that whether I believe in something or not doesn't have much effect on what actually is real. Chiff grinned at that. That's a good attitude to have. Then she leaned forward and in a conspiratorial voice asked, So, do you believe on gods? Chris just blinked at that. What? Never mind. Chiff shrugged, looking Chris over with a thoughtful expression. Here, let me help you. Chiff snapped her fingers and Chris was suddenly completely dry. He gasped in surprise and felt his now dry clothes, definitely relieved at this change, but confused as well. He had no idea who this strange Chif girl was, but had a feeling there was a whole lot about her that was way beyond his experience. Thanks, Chris told her. Anyway, Chif continued with a shrug and an amused smile. My name's Chif, they'll most call me Miss Chif. I was here at the park following up on an old acquaintance when I saw your little show with those boys. Quite amusing the way you dealt with them. Not effective, but amusing. I'm glad to amuse, Chris responded with a wry look. Well, Chif chuckled, you should be. You see, I decided that I like your spirit, so I'm going to help you out. Chris was about to laugh at the idea, but then remembered the way she'd made him dry just by snapping her fingers. He glanced to Pip, who was still sitting on her shoulders, then asked, What, are you going to snap your fingers and make those guys disappear? Nope, Chif shook her head, then shrugged. That's not the way I work. Play might be a better word than work, Pip snickered, suddenly flying out of range when Chif tried to swat her. Then how do you work? Chris asked curiously. He looked at Pip, then back at Chif, not sure he should be worried or not. However, even if he decided that he should be worried by this situation, he knew he wasn't going to show it. Instead, he just grinned. I give you an opportunity, Chif explained, looking a little thoughtful. What you do with it is up to you. Chif held out her hand and a golden medallion suddenly appeared in her palm. She held it up by the thin gold chain so that Chris could see that the medallion was a smooth gold disc with a strange symbol he didn't recognize drawn over the surface, with a copper-colored gold that he thought was probably Black Hills gold. This little trinket, Chif said with a gleam in her eye, is the opportunity one I'm going to give you. It can change anyone who wears it, transforming them physically into whoever they want to be just by thinking about it. Then she handed the medallion to Chris. Chris held up the medallion and stared at it for a moment, feeling nervous yet excited at the same time. He then looked at Chif again and licked his lips. So all I have to do is put it on and think about what I want to look like? You got that right, Pip exclaimed as she landed on Chif's shoulder again. Nice, Chris grinned, beginning to have some ideas of how to use it. And because I like your style, Chif grinned back at Chris, I'm going to do something I don't usually do. I'm going to give you a warning. A warning? Chris asked, his grin fading as he paid careful attention to her. The magic will activate the moment someone next puts this on, Chif explained, her expression fairly serious, though a little gleam of mischief still flickered through her eyes. It will only work for exactly 12 hours after that, then the magic goes bye-bye and whatever shape you're in becomes permanent. Wow, Pip let out a whistle and stared at Chif in surprise. You really do like him. Chif just laughed and Chris noticed that her shirt had changed again. The right side was now red with a black silhouette shape of a sexy devil girl while the left side was white with the black silhouette of a sexy angel. This is really impressive, Chris said carefully, feeling a little overwhelmed, but also a little suspicious. He didn't doubt that magic was real, not after seeing Pip and the strange things Chif had done. But I was wondering what the catch is. Don't worry, Chif rolled her eyes. I'm not after your soul or anything like that. Like I said, I like the way you dealt with those boys, so thought I'd do you a favor. What you do with it though is entirely up to you. Chris nodded, then grinned at her. Then thanks a lot. Chif just grinned again and said, have fun. Then she winked at Chris before suddenly vanishing. Damn, Chris exclaimed, staring at the spot where Chif had been a moment earlier, but seeing no sign of either her or Pip now. That was pretty weird. After a moment, Chris held the medallion up to look at it again, thinking about what she'd told him. He was extremely tempted to try it on right then and see if it really could transform his body. However, if it did work like she said, then that meant he'd only have 12 hours to make use of it. Chris frowned thoughtfully for a moment, knowing that if he was going to use something like this, then he'd have to have a game plan first. This is going to be fun, Chris chuckled to himself as he stuffed the medallion into his pocket and started for home. A lot of fun. Chris sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the gold medallion that the mysterious chief had given him yesterday. He was amazed at himself for not giving in to the temptation to try it out already, though he wasn't going to have to wait any longer. School was supposed to start in just a little bit, which meant it was now the perfect time to make sure it actually worked. I hope she wasn't pulling my leg, Chris muttered. Then Chris looked at his watch to make sure he knew exactly what time it was as he slipped the medallion over his head. There wasn't any strange tingle or glow when he put it on, no sign at all that it was anything other than an ordinary piece of jewelry. Still, after what he'd seen at the park, he wasn't about to give up hope on it really working. Now to try this baby out, Chris grinned nervously. Time to kick the tires. Chris took a deep breath and concentrated on what he wanted to look like, nearly gasping in surprise when the medallion did begin to glow. A moment later he felt a pleasant warmth spread through his body, followed by the sensation of his body actually changing. He could actually feel his bones and muscles shifting, though it wasn't all that uncomfortable, just odd. Chris began growing larger, becoming taller and more muscular with every breath. To his surprise, his clothes were actually growing and changing with him, something which he realized would be extremely useful while using this medallion. However, Chris barely had time to absorb all this before the transformation was finished. Wow, Chris exclaimed as he looked down at himself in amazement. Though Chris didn't have a mirror at hand to check out his transformed body, he already knew what he looked like since he'd pictured it while using the medallion. He looked somewhat like his normal self, though he was now well over 6 feet tall with muscles like a bodybuilder. He flexed a few times, feeling quite impressed with how strong he felt. No one would mess with me if I looked like this, he chuckled to himself, imagining the look of shock on Ron's face if Chris showed up like this and then beat the crap out of him and his goons. And the girls would go crazy. There was no doubt in Chris' mind that most of his problems would go away if he stayed like this, though he could see several new problems as well. For one, he felt a little awkward and clumsy as he wasn't used to this new large size. He also imagined that if he wanted to keep this body permanently, he'd probably have to start going to the gym like crazy just to keep it up. And then of course there were the explanations he'd have to give over his sudden and massive growth. Maybe, Chris mused, knowing that he'd have to think about it a bit more later. At the moment, though, he had specific plans for the medallion, and they didn't include having to explain his sudden growth spurt to his parents on the way out of the house. Chris let out a sigh of disappointment as he concentrated on the medallion again and focused on returning to normal. A moment later his body began to transform again, this time in the exact opposite way as before. He felt himself getting shorter and skinnier, losing the height and muscle as he returned to his normal form. Once Chris was back to normal, he took the medallion off so there wouldn't be any accidental transformations due to a wandering thought. He stared at it for a moment and chuckled, "This is quite an opportunity, all right," before shoving it into his pocket. "I have a feeling that school is going to be quite interesting today." When Chris arrived at school a short time later, he paused at the entrance and realized that with what he had planned it might be a good idea not to be around, or at least not to be seen around. If people noticed him there, then it might cause some questions if they later noticed his absence, so it would be better not to even be at school for the moment. "I guess I'm playing hooky today," Chris grinned as he found a secluded spot and used the medallion to change himself again. This time he kept the changes subtle, making himself 2 inches taller, changing his hair color and features. This way he no longer looked like himself, but he wouldn't stand out either. Chris couldn't help but feeling a little nervous as he walked through the school hallway, half sure that someone would recognize him in spite of his disguise, while also half sure no one would, and that someone would soon demand to know why he was at the school when he wasn't a student. Fortunately, neither occurred, and Chris was able to walk through the crowd without anyone giving him much notice. However, once the first class of the day started, Chris realized one small problem with his plan. Looking as he now did, he couldn't just go into his normal classroom, and wandering around the empty hallway between classes would definitely attract unwanted attention. Talk about a backfire, he muttered to himself, heading to an out-of-the-way bathroom where he could have a little privacy. I would have been better off staying as myself. Chris made sure he was alone in the bathroom, then let out a sigh of relief as he considered his next steps. He mentally reviewed his goals, knowing that he was going to mess with Ron and his crew, make sure they left him alone afterwards, and finally, have some fun. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and he wanted to enjoy it while he could. Chris emptied his bladder in the urinal, then began to chuckle evilly as an idea began to form. He'd already had the basic plan, though he'd intended to wing it to a large degree. This is going to be fun, Chris grinned. He was still chuckling to himself as he began washing his hands at the sink, though the laughter turned to cursing as the water sprayed out sideways and caught his shirt. Chris grimaced and began to pat the small wet spot with some paper towels, annoyed that his good mood had been spoiled. Just my luck, Chris muttered with a shake of a head. Then again, he remembered the medallion and wondered just how bad his luck could be if he'd been given that. Now to get to work. Chris put the medallion on again and concentrated on what he now wanted to look like, keeping an eye on his reflection in the mirror as he did so. His body quickly shimmered and transformed again so that mere seconds later he was actually staring at a familiar face. Lewis. Chris looked down over his body, impressed yet again by just how powerful the medallion was. Even his clothes had changed to the same ones he'd last seen Lewis wearing. Then Chris noticed one more thing. The wet spot. Chris felt the spot on his shirt where he'd gotten wet just a minute earlier, but to his surprise it was now completely dry. Of course it was a completely different shirt now as well. Chris just grinned at that, feeling even more impressed by the medallion. I just wish it didn't wear off so soon, he sighed. Once Chris was sure that he was indeed an exact duplicate of Lewis, he left the restroom and began to walk down the hallway. He no longer had any fear of getting caught, since if any teachers saw him they'd just think he was Lewis. In fact, Chris was actually hoping to get caught. Now where's a teacher when you really need one? Chris mused as he looked around. It didn't take Chris long to find a teacher, and he had to bite back a grin as he walked right in front of the sexy English teacher Mrs. Olson. She was a gorgeous brunette with big cans, which of course made her the favorite teacher of every boy in school. It took Mrs. Olson a few seconds before she noticed Chris, a few seconds which he could have easily used to get away if he so desired. However, Chris had no intention of getting away since his entire goal was to be seen. What are you doing in the hall? Mrs. Olson asked with a slight frown. Shouldn't you be in class? Bite me, Chris responded with a sneer, half hating himself for doing that, especially as he saw the look of surprise on her face. Then Chris gave her the bird before turning and running down the hall, knowing that this was sure to get Lewis in trouble. Once Chris had gone around the corner, he used the medallion to change again, transforming into an exact duplicate of another teacher, middle-aged and balding Mr. Kelly. Chris didn't like the way his new body felt, but knew he wouldn't have to keep it for very long. Too bad I had to do that to her, Chris muttered with a sigh. Chris went back around the corner and was disappointed to see that Mrs. Olson wasn't running after him. He'd been half looking forward to seeing that. Then getting into character, Chris scowled and exclaimed, "That reckless boy nearly ran me over." "He certainly seems to have a serious problem today," Mrs. Olson responded with a very annoyed scowl. "We'll have to see he gets some detention then," Chris told her with a thoughtful nod. "That kind of behavior just can't be tolerated." Mrs. Olson nodded agreement. "No, it can't." Then Chris turned and walked away, chuckling to himself as he did so. That little stunt was certainly bound to get Lewis into a trouble, though this was just the start. After all, Chris hadn't even started with Ron or Kyle yet. "But I can't keep running around the hall like this," Chris mused to himself. "I'm going to have to lay low for a while." Chris frowned and rubbed his balding head as he considered his options, though the feel of his extremely thin hair only made him frown more. He shook his head slightly, musing that he'd never thought that he'd be going bald so early. While Chris tried deciding how he was going to keep from being seen, his thoughts kept drifting to Mrs. Olson. He smiled as he thought of how hot she was, of her incredible rack, and just how killer her body was. Just then Chris felt the now familiar warmth spread through his body as he began to change. He gasped in surprise as he realized that he'd accidentally triggered the medallion. Holy shit, Chris gulped, looking down at his transformed body in amazement and discomfort. He now saw two large mounds pushing out from his shirt, the very same shirt Mrs. Olsen had been wearing minutes earlier. I've turned into her. Chris froze for a moment, thinking that he had to change back into a guy, but then he paused. He looked up and down the hallway self-consciously, then he hesitantly put a hand on one of his new breasts. He licked his lips thoughtfully, then began to grin. This could be kind of interesting, he mused to himself. There was no way Chris would have chosen to turn into a girl, but now that he'd done it by accident he saw no reason not to at least have a little fun with it. After all, this was an opportunity he'd never have again. Chris hurried to the nearest bathroom, pausing to look between the one for boys and girls. He grinned mischievously before going into the girls' bathroom, deciding that he might as well take full advantage of this. Hell, he chuckled to himself, I think a visit to the girls' locker room might be in my future. Once Chris verified that he is indeed the only one in the bathroom, he turned to look himself over in the mirror. He couldn't help but letting out a little wolf whistle as he saw Mrs. Olsen reflected back at him. This felt so wrong yet so exciting at the same time. Hot damn, Chris grinned, grabbing his breasts and licking his lips. He could hardly believe he actually had these things or how interesting they felt. No one would ever believe me if I told them I touched Mrs. Olsen's boobs. Chris was more than a little tempted to strip off his shirt and get a good look at his new assets, though the thought of someone else walking in and catching him stopped him cold. However, one glance at a stall made him grin mischievously as he saw he could still do a little exploring without having to worry quite so much about an intrusion. Oh yeah, Chris grinned as he began undressing enough to expose his breasts. This is what I'm talking about. Chris felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement as he began cupping his bare breasts, amazed at how sensitive his nipples felt. He bit his lip and pulled down his skirt to get better access to his other new body part as well. Damn, this feels good, Chris moaned as his body began to respond to his touch. His nipples hardened and he felt warm and wet down below. I definitely want to check this out. But just then Chris heard someone else come into the bathroom. He froze and grimaced, silently cursing whoever it was who'd interrupted him. He remained motionless while whoever it was used the stall beside him and eventually left. Only then did Chris let out a sigh of relief, knowing that the moment had passed. I guess it isn't a good idea doing this here. He let out a sigh of disappointment. Then, with a shake of his head and a muttered curse, Chris used the medallion to change himself once again. Being Mrs. Olsen could be a lot of fun, but it would probably get a little too much attention. Besides, using the medallion was a much quicker and easier way of getting dressed again. Chris stepped out of the bathroom stall and took a look at his new face in the mirror. He was still a girl since it would have been awkward being seen as a boy walking out of the girls' bathroom. Then again, he smiled to himself, it might be a good idea to walk out as Ron as long as someone else saw him. Not bad, Chris mused, reaching up and running a hand through his now long strawberry blonde hair. Not bad at all. However, Chris was no longer an adult woman, but was now a teenage girl who looked like just another female student. He still had a really nice body, though his breasts were a little smaller than they'd been as Mrs. Olsen. He imagined this was the way Mrs. Olsen's body had looked back when she'd been this age. I won't be invisible this way, Chris thought aloud, but then shrugged. But who cares? This is kind of fun. He cupped his breasts, then winked at his reflection and blew it a kiss before turning to leave. Chris didn't have to wander the hall for very long before class ended and the halls were flooded with other students. He felt a little awkward to be walking among them as a girl, knowing exactly what the boys who looked at him were thinking. However, he had to admit to himself there was something a bit exciting about that as well. This is kind of weird, Chris mused, looking around and being very aware of just how many boys were looking at him. He was especially aware of just how many were looking at his chest, not that he blamed them since he knew quite well he had some damn nice boobs. Then Chris frowned, knowing that he couldn't just keep wandering the halls and dodging teachers. Maybe he could change back to normal and go to his normal classes, but that seemed like such a complete and absolute waste of an opportunity. I've got a better idea, Chris chuckled to himself as he went to his normal classroom. Chris stepped through the door and watched the other students taking their seats. The teacher, Mr. Adams, gave him a curious look, but he just smiled and tried to look a little shy and nervous. It was hard to do when he was actually feeling kind of smug. "Hi," Chris said, trying to sound nervous as well. "I'm new here and they told me I should come to this class." Mr. Adams frowned for a moment. "No one told me about a new student." Then he paused to look Chris over before asking, "And what's your name?" "Christine," Chris responded with a smile, remembering when Ron had teased him by calling him that. It seemed appropriate to use that same name now. "Okay, Christine," Mr. Adams said, gesturing towards an empty seat, "you may sit there for today." Chris nodded and started towards the seat, glancing over to the empty seat he normally sat in and then looking over the other students. His gaze settled on Ron, whom he gave a suggestive wink to before taking his seat. "This is going to be interesting," Chris mused to himself. "Very interesting indeed." Chris smiled as he sat in the lunchroom listening to the girls at his table talking. He found it amusing that they all just accepted him as one of them, albeit as a new girl in school. He found being the new girl even more amusing as none of them had any idea of just how new a girl he really was. At the moment though, Chris was trying to keep a straight face as he listened to two girls talking about Lewis, each one of them sounding more disgusted than the other. "That freak actually pissed his pants right in front of everyone, then just grinned about it and walked away," one girl exclaimed. Chris actually felt a bit proud of that bit, though somewhat embarrassed as well. It had been easy enough to turn himself into Lewis during one of the class breaks, though not quite as easy to break all his potty training and intentionally piss himself in front of everyone, leaving Lewis with the damaged reputation. "And it all disappeared when I changed back," Chris mused to himself, thankful that the piss had vanished along with the body and clothes he was wearing at that time. "That Lewis kid seems like a weird one," Chris added to the conversation, then gave an exaggerated shudder of disgust as he lied, "I actually saw him pick his nose and eat it." The girls were all appropriately horrified at that, which only made Chris chuckle. If nothing else, this would create the kind of reputation that Lewis would never escape as long as he remained in this school. He would never get a girl to go out with him now, and he was left with the reputation of a laughingstock. Of course, Kyle now had a ruined reputation as well, thanks to another impersonation on Chris' part. "And did you hear about his friend Kyle?" another girl broke in, almost as if on cue. "Oh yeah," a blonde giggled, "I heard he walked into the girls' locker room, then pulled down his pants and began jacking off." There were gasps of shocked horror at that as well as more giggles. Chris almost felt guilty for that one, almost. Of course he hadn't actually jacked off in the girls' locker room. He'd only flashed a few of them with full frontal, but the story had changed as it spread. "It was horrible," Chris added, deciding to add a little more to the exaggerated rumors. "I mean, I was there and he was so small." He tried to act uncomfortable and embarrassed as he held his fingers about 2 inches apart. "I mean, he was the size of a baby." That immediately created another stir and round of whispered giggles. Kais grinned, knowing the rumors would soon spread around the entire school that Kyle was not only a pervert, but one with a tiny dick. "What else can I do?" Chris mused, having already made sure to impersonate Lewis with frilly pink girls' underwear while in the boys' locker room and having insulted a few teachers as Kyle. It still amazed him what damage he could do to their reputations in the time between classes. And I haven't even started on Ron. Ron was the most difficult of the 3 jerks to pin down. Chris knew that he could easily ruin Ron's reputation the same way he'd done with the other 2, that he could get him expelled from school or even framed for some crimes that would guarantee a little time in juvie. However, none of that really appealed to Chris. A little humiliation was fine for the lackeys, but their ringleader deserved a little more. But what? Chris asked himself. Then Chris had an idea. He'd humiliate Ron in front of the entire school, not by impersonating Ron, but by making him actually face it. And what was more humiliating than having some girl you like totally insult you in front of everyone? It also seemed oddly appropriate since it was an incident like that which caused Ron to start coming after Chris in the first place. That shouldn't be much problem. Chris looked down at his breasts and smirked, knowing that he already had Ron's full attention. All he had to do was play with it a little more. It'll be like taking candy from a baby. Chris couldn't resist smirking as he went in search of Ron, fully aware of the way every boy he passed looked at him. He'd already caught Ron doing the same, which of course he'd encouraged with a few looks and winks of his own. It didn't take Chris long to find Ron sitting at a table with his two miserable and confused-looking cohorts. Kyle and Lewis were protesting that they didn't do the things they were accused of, but Ron obviously wasn't buying it. "Come on," Ron glared at them, "all sorts of people saw you guys acting like freaks, so don't deny it. What, you guys got some good drugs and didn't share?" Chris was tempted to just sit back and watch, but decided to give the two goons a little mercy, for the moment. "Hey." He walked over towards Ron, trying to use the sexy walk he'd seen some real girls using and succeeding better than he'd hoped. At least he knew he'd succeeded from the way all three boys were staring at him. Hi," Ron responded, obviously surprised at having an attractive girl coming up to him like this. "I'm Christine." Chris introduced himself with an attempt to look sweet and innocent. It wasn't easy since he wanted to spit in Ron's face. "I'm new here and kind of got lost." He tried acting embarrassed as he added, "I recognized you from a couple of my classes, so thought I'd ask if you could help." "Sure," Ron smirked. "I'm Ron, by the way." "I was trying to find this classroom," Chris said, holding up a piece of paper he'd written a room number on. Ron was more than eager to help Chris out and get into the good graces of a pretty girl, though Chris couldn't help but thinking that Ron was a bit slimy about it. He kind of doubted that a real girl would fall for Ron's nice guy act, but he had to pretend to. Chris talked to Ron for several minutes, pretending to be friendly and even a little bit interested in him. Then when he finally turned and walked away, he let out a sigh of relief, glad to be away from Ron again. "At least this time he didn't have those goons try beating me up," Chris told himself. Then he glanced back, thinking about Nick and Lewis and what he was going to do with them. He figured he'd embarrassed them enough, but he didn't like the fact that Ron still had them to do his dirty work. "I'll have to do something about that." Chris smirked as he got back into character, currently looking just like Ron. He'd been having a little fun getting Ron in trouble, though not too much. He didn't want Ron getting too suspicious or kicked out of school, not yet at least. That could come later. Then Chris saw Lewis getting closer and smiled, knowing that this was just the right time. He waited a moment longer until Lewis was almost right next to him, then he pretended to talk on his cell phone, making sure Lewis could hear him. "Yeah," Chris said in his best Ron impersonation, "Kyle and Lewis are total idiots. I mean, those losers actually think I like them. That means they'll make the perfect scapegoats. We'll rob that store and make sure they get all the blame. No. It won't be a problem, not with those idiots." Chris watched Lewis from the corner of his eye, pretending he didn't see the other boy as he hung up his imaginary phone call. He'd made a similar call in Kyle's hearing just a short time ago, making sure that neither boy would trust Ron again. And without his goons, Ron wouldn't be nearly as dangerous. Chris chuckled as he walked away, then reached under his shirt to feel the medallion. It was such an amazing thing, giving him opportunities he never would have imagined before. And he still had a few more hours to take advantage of those opportunities as well. Once Chris was sure he was in a safe place where no one could see him, he used the medallion to turn himself back into Christine. He smiled as he looked down at his feminine body, especially his boobs. There was something appealing about having a pair of boobs so readily available to touch. It feels kind of funny having them, Chris mused to himself, but they're definitely nice to have too. Then Chris shook his head and cleared his thoughts. As much fun as it might be to really play with his new body, he knew he couldn't afford to do that right now. For one, there were way too many people wandering around school for that to be a good idea, and for another, he still had work to do. After this, Chris began looking for Ron, though it didn't take him long to find him. Ron was in back of the school, smoking a cigarette behind the bleachers. Chris had to push down his real feelings towards Ron and smile pleasantly as he approached. "Oh, I didn't know you were out here," Chris exclaimed, acting surprised. "I was just coming out for some fresh air and thought I'd be alone." "Yeah," Ron smirked as he took a drag from his cigarette. "There's lots of fresh air here." Chris had to fight back the urge to roll his eyes and tell Ron that the air was all between his ears. Instead, he gave a fake chuckle and said, "It's so funny I run into you out here." "Yeah," Ron grinned, giving Chris an appreciative look. "But I'm glad you did." For the next several minutes, Chris pretended to be charmed by Ron as they made small talk. When they began walking back to the building, Chris could tell that it was almost time. He was sure that Ron was going to ask him out soon. Once they were back in the halls, Ron asked, "You want to go out with me sometime? Maybe tonight?" Chris smiled, knowing that this was it. He quickly looked around and saw that there were other students all around them in the hallway. Now he could turn Ron down in the most insulting and humiliating way possible, making sure that everyone saw. He'd make Ron a laughingstock and completely ruin his reputation. Then Chris paused as another idea suddenly came to him. He grinned as he turned to Ron, responding as sweetly as he could. "Sure, I'd love to." "Great," Ron grinned back smugly, as though he'd never expected any other answer. "I can pick you up at 5. After they'd agreed on a few more details, Chris said, "I've got to get going. I don't want to be late to class on my first day there." Then he winked at Ron, "And I'll see you later." Chris continued smiling as he turned away and only let out a sigh of relief once he was far enough away. He felt dirty and disgusted with himself for the way he'd been kissing up to Ron, though he knew it would be worth it. "Oh yeah," Chris chuckled to himself, "this is really gonna be worth it." Chris sat back in his chair, smirking slightly as he watched a group of girls whispering to each other and occasionally glancing over at Kyle and giggling. Chris couldn't help but feeling pleased by how well his plan for Kyle and Lewis was working. Their poor reputations had spread through the whole school, and now no one took them seriously, as bullies or anything else. Then Chris turned his attention back to the teacher and pretended he was paying attention. After all, it wouldn't do to be seen paying too much attention to either Kyle or the people who were talking to him behind his back. While Chris was waiting for the class to be finished and the school day along with it, he glanced over at one boy who sat in the front row looking just as bored as he felt. Chris knew Tommy, though they were hardly good friends. Tommy was a nice guy, but a bit of a loner with a reputation for being something of a nerd. Then Chris noticed that Tommy kept glancing to a girl sitting a short distance away, staring at her for a moment with obvious infatuation before quickly looking away. The object of Tommy's attention was a very pretty girl named Nadine, whom Chris had admired himself once or twice. "Too bad she doesn't even know he exists," Chris mused to himself, knowing exactly how Tommy felt. After all, there'd been pretty girls he was interested in before, and they'd never really noticed him much either. As soon as the bell rang indicating both class and the school day was over, Chris got up and walked to where Nadine was getting up to leave. He wasn't quite sure what he was doing and was acting more on impulse than anything else. "Who is that boy?" Chris leaned over and asked Nadine, gesturing to Tommy as he picked up his own school bag. "There's something interesting about him." Nadine looked at Chris for a moment, then at Tommy with an expression of curiosity. "That's Tommy," she responded before giving Tommy a more intense look as she tried seeing what it was that Chris found interesting about him. "I'm Christine," Chris introduced himself. "Nadine," she told Chris. "Welcome to the school." Thanks, Chris told her as he began to leave. However, he glanced back and noticed that Nadine was watching Tommy with a thoughtful expression. Chris just grinned before continuing on his way, muttering, "I hope you appreciate that, Tommy." Chris hurried away from school as fast as he could, not wanting to deal with Ron again until their date and not wanting to see either Kyle or Lewis again, period. He let out a sigh of relief once he was off school grounds and heading on his way home. A short time later, Chris was sitting in his bedroom back in his own form, holding the medallion in his hands and staring at it while he killed time before his date. He could hardly believe that this small piece of jewelry could open such a world of opportunity for him. Opportunity for some fun, for revenge. And Chris wasn't quite sure what else it offered him, but he knew that there were other opportunities as well. But not much time, he sighed. He'd chosen to use his limited time having fun getting even with Ron and the goons, which meant there wasn't enough time to explore his other options. Once Chris decided that he'd killed enough time, he slipped the medallion around his neck again and grinned. A minute later, he was out of his house again and was on his way to where he'd agreed to meet Ron, transforming himself back to Christine on the way. "Hello, girls," Chris chuckled as he looked down at his breasts, fighting the impulse to make them a little larger. While having even larger breasts might be kind of fun, not to mention impress Ron even more, he thought that he was already busty enough and didn't want to overdo it. It didn't take long for Chris to reach his destination, a small apartment complex about a block away from his house. He stood out in front where he'd agreed to meet Ron, having told Ron that this was where he lived. Ron arrived a short time later, driving a beat-up old Camaro that had seen better days. He pulled up beside Chris, then stepped out with a smirk that made Chris want to smack him upside the head. "Come on, hop in," Ron said, giving Chris an appreciative though somewhat lecherous look. "Where are we going?" Chris asked as sweetly as he could while he climbed into the car. "Wait and see, babe," Ron responded. Chris just rolled his eyes and bit back a smart-ass comment before exclaiming, "I can't wait." Chris wasn't surprised when Ron's big destination as a greasy burger joint that had a reputation as being cheap for more than just the cost. Chris had eaten there before and wasn't at all impressed. In fact, he rather would have eaten at Burger King, though he certainly didn't say so. Even though Chris hadn't been expecting much from dinner, it was even worse than he'd expected. The food itself wasn't impressive, though it wasn't too bad either. The worst part of the dinner was the company and the fact that Ron wouldn't stop telling bad jokes and stories that made himself out to be some sort of tough guy. "Wow," Chris played along. "That's incredible. You mean you really beat up 3 guys all by yourself?" "Yeah," Ron smirked. "I mean, they were being real jerks, so I didn't have much choice. I mean, that's the kind of guy I am." Chris just gasped in mock awe, biting his tongue so he wouldn't point out that the incident really hadn't happened like that at all. Chris had heard all about the real fight, and the truth was that Ron and his 2 goons had beaten up 3 guys whom he'd overheard insulting him. In fact, the 3 guys they'd beaten up hadn't even been any kind of a threat. They were 1 grade lower and were the kind of guys who spent a lot more time playing video games than doing anything at all physical. "You're so tough," Chris played along. When they'd finished eating, things went almost exactly as Chris expected. Ron had been finding excuses to touch Chris all through the dinner, touching his hand by accident and the like. As soon as they got up to leave, Ron actually put his arm around Chris' shoulder and pulled him tight. "I know this place with some great scenery," Ron said. "You'll love it." "Really?" Chris forced a smile. "I can't wait." Ron quickly proved just how predictable he was when he drove them to the Heights, a local landmark that was little more than a hill that looked down on a park. The Heights did have a good view, though it was less known for the scenery than for the fact that it was the place teenagers went to make out. As soon as they arrived, Chris hopped out of the car and looked down at the park, exclaiming, "Wow, it does have a good view." "Doesn't it?" Ron smirked, lighting a cigarette and watching Chris with an almost hungry expression. Chris looked at his watch, then said, "This reminds me of a place we had where I used to live." Then he launched into a story about a fictional park where everyone went for picnics. Ron was obviously annoyed and impatient, though he tried hiding it. That just amused Chris, who stretched the story on a little longer. "That's great and all," Ron said when Chris was done, coming up next to Chris, putting an arm around his shoulder. "You know, your story and all the scenery really is romantic." Chris thought that this was one of the worst pickup lines ever and suspected that Ron was going to ask him what sign he was next. However, Chris decided not to give Ron that opportunity. He glanced at his watch again and smiled. "Yeah, it is," Chris said in his most sexually suggestive voice. He had no idea how well it would work since he didn't exactly have any experience in trying to seduce guys, but it did seem to have the right result. Ron began moving in for a kiss, but Chris pulled away and asked, "How about I give you a little massage?" He winked at Ron, who grinned in response. Chris had Ron sit down on a bench that was set up to give a good view down on the park, and then went behind the bench and began to massage Ron's shoulders. He briefly considered just putting his hands around Ron's neck and choking him, but managed to ignore the temptation. "Now close your eyes," Chris whispered into Ron's ear. "We're going to try something a little exciting." "Sounds good to me," Ron grinned, not being able to see the even bigger grin that Chris wore. Chris stopped the massage long enough to pull out the medallion and gently slip it over Ron's head. Then Chris went back to massaging Ron's shoulders for a minute before bending over to whisper in Ron's ear again. "Now imagine your ultimate dream girl," Chris suggested in his sexiest voice. "Imagine just how hot and sexy she looks." Then Chris felt Ron's shoulders shifting underneath his hands. Ron's body began to shift and transform while Chris continued with the massage, digging his fingers in deep enough to distract Ron from the sensations of his changing. A few seconds later, Ron had become a very sexy girl with long black hair. "Now imagine the sexy clothes she wears," Chris instructed him, still keeping his own voice sweet and suggestive. Ron's clothes all shimmered and changed, transforming into something that was more slutty than sexy. He had stiletto-heeled shoes that he hadn't noticed since he was still sitting down, fishnet stockings, a black leather miniskirt, and a skimpy shirt that showed so much cleavage it was nearly indecent. Chris thought that Ron now looked like a cheap hooker. "Now imagine her with bigger breasts," Chris told Ron. Ron was already very busty, but almost immediately began to grow even larger. Even larger. "Oh yes," Chris purred. "You love big bouncy breasts. Huge breasts. Monster hooters." At this point Ron's breasts had become enormous, each one nearly the size of a watermelon. This was finally too much for Chris to distract him from, and Ron jumped to his feet in surprise, then staggered on the high heels and fell face first, or chest first, onto the ground. "What the fuck?" Ron screamed in shock as he grabbed his mammoth chest and stared at it in disbelief and confusion. Chris just stood there and stared at Ron for a moment before he burst out laughing. "I say, it looks like you turned into a girl." Then Chris went to try getting the medallion back from Ron, knowing he didn't have much time. He had been about to take the medallion back right before Ron realized he'd changed and freaked out. Now things had become more complicated. "What the hell is this?" Ron demanded, trying to get to his feet and grabbing the bench for support. "Can you imagine if those things were even bigger?" Chris asked innocently, gesturing to Ron's massive breasts. Then as he watched, they began growing larger again, which made Chris chuckle. He'd intended to use this as a distraction to get the medallion, but Ron only freaked out more, making it even more difficult for Chris to get close. Just then Chris' watch began to beep as the alarm went off, indicating that time was up. It had been 12 hours since he'd first put on the medallion and activated the magic. "No," Chris gasped, staring at the medallion around Ron's neck as it began to glow faintly and then just crumbled away to dust. "No." For a moment Chris just stood there, hardly able to believe it. He'd planned it so well, taking the medallion back and turning back to himself at the last minute, so he could rub Ron's face in the fact that he was the one who'd changed him. However, there was no way Chris could change back now. "You can thank Kyle and Lewis for this," Chris lied, deciding that he didn't want Ron to have any idea of who he really was. That got tired of you bossing them around all the time, so asked me to give you that medallion. He shook his head for a moment and added, I had no idea it would do something like this to you. Kyle? Ron asked, staring down at his transformed body in horror. Lewis? Then he snarled, those fucking traitors. Chris just smiled sweetly and waved to Ron. Have a fun walk back. Then Chris turned and began walking away, holding up Ron's car keys and letting Ron see them before casually tossing them off the hill. Get back here, Ron screamed, though Chris just continued walking without looking back. It's gonna be a long walk, Chris sighed as he looked down at himself, knowing he had the same walk back that Ron did, though not as much extra weight on his chest to carry with him. Too bad. Then he thought of the look on Ron's face and chuckled. Chris cupped his breasts and mused, this just might be worth it. Chris sat in his bedroom, considering his current condition and looking at himself in a small handheld mirror. The medallion had vanished, leaving him as Christine, so this beautiful face he stared at in the mirror was going to be with him for a very long time. Chris glanced towards his door, knowing it was locked, but feeling a little nervous anyway. He just hoped no one even knocked on it. After all, he'd stuck back into the house after getting back from dealing with Ron, so his parents hadn't seen him like this yet. Somehow Chris didn't think that explaining his sex change to his family would be an easy conversation, especially since everyone knew that this kind of thing was completely impossible. Amazing how many impossible things can actually happen, Chris mused aloud. You've got that right, another voice exclaimed. What the? Chris gasped in surprise as he turned around and saw Miss Chiff standing there with the pixie pip floating over her shoulder. How did you get in? Then he paused to shake his head. Never mind. Stupid question. It sure is, Pip grinned. I did warn you about the time limit, Chiff said, sounding almost apologetic. I know, Chris responded, looking down at himself and shrugging. It's not your fault things didn't work out quite the way I planned. Most people wouldn't see it that way, Chiff grinned. For some reason, people usually blame me when an opportunity one offer doesn't go quite as expected. I wonder why, Pip muttered sarcastically as she rolled her eyes. Then she quickly darted out of the way as Chiff tried to swat at her with her hand. Unfortunately, I am unable to undo your changes, Chiff explained to Chris, shrugging as she did so. The rules of the game were that you would be left as you were. Chris blinked at that. Game? Then he gave her a suspicious look. I thought you were doing me a favor. Everything is a game. Chiff grinned at him with an amused twinkle in her eyes. Even favors. And she always follows the rules, Pip added, even though she's the one who makes them up and is the only one who usually knows what they are. Pip flew in a circle around Chiff's head and muttered, though I always wondered at the irony of a goddess of chaos being so fond of rules. You can't have a game without rules, Chiff pointed out with a faint chuckle. Then she looked at Chris and shrugged. That's why I can't change you back. Chris stared at Chiff for a moment before shrugging. That's okay. I don't mind being like this. He gestured down at himself and added, I had a lot of fun being Christine and I think being a hot chick will be a lot more fun than being a plain-looking guy. What? Pip gasped in surprise. Chiff just smirked, rubbing her nails along her shirt, then holding them out to admire them. I could have told you that. Then Chris asked, just out of curiosity, exactly what were the rules to your game? Quite simple, Chiff responded curiously. Once I gave you the medallion, I would not interfere until the time limit was over, nor would I undo or alter any changes that the medallion made. Chris nodded thoughtfully at that, then carefully asked, So, is there any rule about you being able to give me another opportunity? The kid is crazy, Pip blurted out. However, Chiff just laughed. I like the way you think, kid. Speaking of which, I like how you tricked that Ron boy into changing himself. Then she paused to watch Chris with an expression of obvious amusement. But to answer your question, there is no specific rule. Pip landed on Chif's shoulder and shook her head, looking to Chris and saying, most people aren't dumb enough to come back for more. Normally I might take advantage of that opportunity, Chif smirked, making Chris suddenly wonder if he'd made a big mistake. However, she continued, but like I said, kid, I kind of like you. Because of that, I'm going to do something else I don't usually do. I'm going to help clean up some of the mess. With that, Chif reached behind her back for a moment and brought it back into view with a small silk pouch which she held out to Chris. This is gullibility powder. All you have to do is blow a little into someone's face and they will become very accepting of anything you tell them for the next few minutes. She grinned mischievously as she continued, usually it's used to make people accept and believe outrageous stories, but in this case it can make them believe outrageous truths, such as the truth of your identity. That sounds interesting. Chris grinned as he accepted the pouch, imagining what he could do with something like this. Sure, he could make his family believe his story about who he really was, but he could also mess with a few people as well. There is only enough for a few doses, Chif explained, her expression turning a little more serious. So be careful who you choose to use it on. Damn, Chris muttered, reluctantly deciding that he'd have to give up the idea of using it for practical jokes. Convincing his family of his identity would be a little more important. Then Chif put her hand behind her back and this time brought it back out with a large envelope held in it. And here are all those annoying things like birth certificate and social security card that you mortals seem to need. As far as anyone else is concerned, you will now be your own cousin Christine. Thanks, Chris said as he accepted the envelope and looked at the paperwork inside. After just a quick look through, everything she'd just given him looked to be in order. And though he was no expert, he thought they looked authentic too. I hate paperwork, Chif muttered, giving Chris a stead look as she added, I hope you appreciate that. I do, Chris told her quickly. I really do. Okay then, Chif said, looking at her wrist as though checking the time on a watch even though she wore no watch there, I have to get going. I'm supposed to be having dinner with my sister Hap and I really want to get to the restaurant before she accidentally destroys it. Pip just chuckled. I don't want to miss that. Me either, Chif grinned back at her diminutive sidekick. Chif turned her attention back to Chris and told him, I'm glad to have met someone so amusing. Who knows, perhaps we shall meet again someday. Then she snapped her fingers and was suddenly gone along with Pip. Chris just stared at the empty space where Miss Chif had been standing a moment before, then shook his head. He chuckled to himself, wondering why he was surprised when nearly everything he'd seen her do had been impossible, and this wasn't even the first time he'd seen her do that disappearing trick. I kind of hope I do see her again someday, Chris mused to himself even though he had a feeling that running into Miss Chif again might not be the best thing for him. That would have to be interesting if nothing else. Then Chris looked down at himself and his transformed body, smiling faintly as he did so. He certainly hadn't intended to stay like this permanently, though now that it had happened he didn't really mind. In fact, the more he thought about it the more curious he became. Like he'd told Chif, being a boy had always felt kind of boring and he had a feeling that having a body like this would be a whole lot more interesting, and a lot more fun. I can't wait to check you out, he chuckled to himself, about to undress when a thought occurred to him. Chris had been dying to really check this body out all day, but didn't have the privacy or opportunity to really do so until now. Now he had all the time and opportunity he'd ever want, though he still couldn't do it quite yet. He still had something else he had to do first. Chris held up the small pouch of gullibility powder that Chif had given him and smiled. Before he could do anything else he still had to have a little conversation with his family and explain his strange transformation, not to mention convince his parents that he deserved a very large increase in his allowance. After all, Chris chuckled to himself as he left his room, why waste a perfectly good opportunity?